In front of 43 people at my own dining room table, my son-in-law leaned back in his chair, looked me straight in the eye, and said, "No offense, Frank, but you're just not relevant anymore. The world moved on and left you behind." He was smiling when he said it, that relaxed, easy smile of a man who has never once been made to answer for anything he has said. My daughter, Renee, sat 3 seats down and reached for the breadbasket like she hadn't heard a word. She had heard every word. He had no idea. That was the last time Raymond Stokes would ever feel comfortable in my home. If you found your way here today, I'm glad you did. Before we go any further, take a second to subscribe and drop a comment. Where in the world are you listening from? Your city? Your state? It means more than you know. Some elements of this story are shaped for reflection, and the life lessons inside them. Names and settings are coincidental, but the message that one is real, and I hope it stays with you. I want to take you back to where it actually started. Not the dining room table, not the smile. It started the way it always starts, with people like Raymond, quietly, reasonably. One small thing at a time, until the small things had rearranged your entire life, and you weren't sure how to explain to anyone exactly when it had happened, or why you had let it go on so long. Renee married Raymond Stokes in September of 2018. I walked her down the aisle at a vineyard outside of Knoxville, Tennessee. She was 31 years old, wearing her grandmother's pearl earrings, and she looked at me at the bottom of that aisle with the expression I had been carrying in my chest since the day she was born, the one that is too large to put words around. I handed her to a man I had met 14 times. I thought I knew what I was doing. I thought I knew who he was. I was wrong about both. Raymond worked in commercial real estate. He was good-looking in the way that certain men are good-looking, the kind that announces itself and expects to be thanked for it. He was charming in social situations with the practiced ease of a man who had learned early that warmth deployed strategically costs nothing and gets you almost everything. My wife, Carol, had liked him immediately. I had been slower. I told myself I was just being a protective father. I told myself I was overreacting. I spent 3 years telling myself those two things. The first thing that disappeared was my truck. Not permanently. That's how it starts, never permanently. It's always just for the weekend, just while mine's in the shop, just until I can get the registration sorted out. My F-250, the dark green one I'd owned for 6 years, started showing up in Raymond's driveway with a frequency that stopped being coincidental around the 3rd month of their marriage. He and Renee lived 12 minutes away, in a house I had helped them put a down payment on. Close enough that borrowing felt neighborly. Far enough that I couldn't see what was happening until it had already become normal. One Tuesday morning, I came outside to drive Carol to her ophthalmologist appointment and found the driveway empty. I stood there for a moment in the November cold, looking at the concrete rectangle where my truck was supposed to be, the oil stain on the left side I had been meaning to clean for a year. I called Renee. Raymond needed it for a job site, she said. He forgot to ask. He'll have it back by 3. Carol and I called a cab. Carol didn't say anything about it on the ride over. She watched the window and kept her hands folded in her lap, and I knew the way I had always known things with her, 41 years of that particular knowing, that she was absorbing something and choosing not to name it yet. He had it back by 7. 6 weeks later it happened again. Then a 3rd time. By the 4th time, the truck was gone on a Saturday morning when I had promised my neighbor Walt that I would help him haul lumber. I had to call Walt and explain. Walt was 70 years old and had been my neighbor for 19 years, and I had never in those 19 years failed to show up for something I said I would do. I stood in the kitchen after hanging up with Walt and felt heat move up the back of my neck in a way that had nothing to do with the weather. I talked to Renee about it that Sunday. She listened with the patient, slightly tired expression she had developed in the past year, the one that meant she had already rehearsed her response and was waiting for me to finish so she could deliver it. "Dad, he just relies on it for work sometimes. His car is fine for regular stuff, but the job sites need the bed space. Can't you just let him know when you need it in advance?" I looked at my daughter. She was 32 years old, sharp as she had always been, and she was asking me to schedule around a man who took my property without asking. I said okay. I went home. I sat in the garage for a while with the lights off. Then came the power tools. I have a workshop in the back of my garage. 40 years of accumulated equipment, a table saw, a compound miter saw, 3 drills, an orbital sander, a router. Every tool in that shop has a history. The DeWalt miter saw I bought after retiring from 24 years as a structural engineer. The router I used to build the bookshelf in Carol's reading room that she calls her favorite piece of furniture in the house. These were not just tools. They were the record of what I had done with my hands in the years when my hands still had things to prove. Raymond started borrowing them one at a time. The first drill, then the second drill, then the orbital sander for a deck project at a client's property. He always had a reason. The reasons were always reasonable. He always said he'd return things by the end of the week. End of the week became end of the month. End of the month became when I finally walked over myself and stood in their garage and looked at my tools arranged on his workbench like they had always lived there. I didn't say anything that day. I told myself it wasn't worth the argument. I am still, even now, sorting out what I actually meant by that, whether I was being patient or whether I had simply started believing that my own things weren't worth arguing about. The router never came back. I noticed its absence on a rainy Wednesday afternoon in March when I wanted to add a detail to a cedar box I was making for Carol's birthday. I checked the shop twice. I drove to their house. I rang the doorbell. No answer. I looked through the side garage window. The router was sitting on Raymond's workbench under a layer of sawdust that had nothing to do with me. I drove home. I made the cedar box without the detail. Carol loved it anyway. She always loved everything I made her. That made it worse, somehow. Carol had a garden on the south side of the yard. Not a grand one, a careful one. Raised beds she had built herself with help from YouTube tutorials and a book she kept on the kitchen counter. Tomatoes, squash, 3 kinds of lettuce, an herb section along the far end that smelled like something that belongs in a different century. She was in that garden every morning between April and October, kneeling in the dirt with her reading glasses pushed up on her forehead, talking to the plants in the low, unhurried voice she used for things she loved, without needing anyone to witness it. Renee started harvesting from it. Not asking. Harvesting. She would come over on a Sunday afternoon, and I would hear the gate latch click, and 20 minutes later she would leave with a bag of tomatoes and a fistful of Carol's basil, without having knocked on the door. The first time, Carol noticed the gap in the tomato row and stood at the kitchen window with her coffee, counting. She didn't say anything to me. She went back to the garden the next morning and I watched her from the doorway, kneeling in the dirt, pressing her fingers into the soil next to each remaining plant like she was taking inventory of what she had left. I brought it up to Renee on a Tuesday. She looked genuinely puzzled, the way she looked when she thought I was making something out of nothing. Dad, there's so much out there. Mom always sends food home with me anyway. Can't she just tell me when something's off limits? I thought about Carol counting tomatoes through the kitchen window. I thought about 41 years of watching that woman give away everything she had to the people she loved without once asking them to notice. I thought about what it means to have something taken and then be asked to establish in advance which things you'd like to keep. The money was next, not large amounts. That would have been easier to name. It was the kind of financial drift that only becomes visible over time, a dinner out where the check slid to my side of the table without discussion. A home repair at Renee and Raymond's that Raymond mentioned I might be able to help with, just until things settled, which they never did. A weekend trip Carol and I had planned to Asheville that Raymond proposed joining, which meant upgrading the rental, which meant the cost changed, which meant I paid for it. I paid for all of it. Carol touched my arm on the drive home from Asheville. She didn't speak. She just pressed her fingers into my forearm and held them there, and I felt the pressure of everything she was not saying move through her hand and into me. There was a night in February of 2021 that I have not told anyone about until now. Our granddaughter, Lily Renee, and Raymond's daughter was 4 years old and running a fever of 104 in the middle of the night. Carol and I had been watching her that week because Raymond had a conference in Atlanta and Renee had a project deadline at the architecture firm where she worked. We had done this regularly. Weekly, actually. More than weekly. We were what you might call a full-time childcare arrangement that had been described to us as occasional help. Lily woke at 2 a.m. burning up and frightened. Carol got to her first. I heard the quick, soft sound of Carol's footsteps in the hallway and then Lily's voice, thin and confused. And I was already standing by the time Carol appeared in the bedroom doorway. Her face said everything. I called Renee. It went to voicemail. I called again. Voicemail. I called Raymond's phone. 4 rings, then nothing. Carol and I worked through the night. Cold cloth on Lily's forehead. Children's Tylenol every 4 hours. Carol singing in the rocking chair with Lily curled against her chest while I sat on the floor with my back against the wall, watching the rise and fall of that small rib cage. The fever broke at around 5 in the morning. I sat there on the floor and did not feel relief so much as a kind of hollowing out, a fatigue that was not physical. Renee called back at 8:17. She sounded sleepy and apologetic in the way people sound when they are apologizing for something they have already decided wasn't really their fault. "I'm so sorry, Dad. I had my ringer off." "How is she?" Lily was asleep in Carol's lap in the rocking chair, one small fist pressed against her own cheek. "She's fine," I said. "She's going to be fine." I set the phone down on the nightstand. Lily stirred, opened her eyes halfway, and looked at me with the unfocused gaze of a child still half in a dream. "Grandpa," she said. "You stayed." "I stayed, baby," I said. "I'm right here." She closed her eyes again. Carol's hand moved in slow circles on Lily's back. I sat on the floor for a long time after that without moving. "I want you to know something before I tell you what came next. I loved my daughter without condition or qualification for her entire life. I built her a treehouse when she was 7. I drove 4 hours round trip 41 times during her years at the University of Tennessee to bring her home-cooked food and sit with her when graduate school was grinding her down. I was in the front row of every presentation, every opening, every moment she would allow a witness. I am not telling you this story because I stopped loving her. I am telling you this story because love without limits is not love. It is a room with no walls, and anyone can walk through. The dining room table moment came in March of 2022. It was a birthday dinner for Carol, 63 years old. I had made her favorite meal pot roast with root vegetables and the dinner rolls she had loved since the first time I made them 30 years ago. Recipe from my mother's index card that is now kept in the box on the second shelf of our pantry. I had set the table with the linen we used for occasions, lit candles. It was a Wednesday evening, and the plan had been immediate family: Renee, Raymond, Lily, Carol, and me. Raymond arrived 40 minutes late. He had been on a work call. He came in without apology, went to the refrigerator, helped himself to a beer, came to the table, and sat down while everyone else had been sitting for 15 minutes with the food going cold. The conversation moved the way dinner conversations move when one person at the table is performing for an audience only he can see. Raymond talked about a deal he was working on, a property acquisition outside of Nashville that was going to be his word transformative. He talked about the market, about his instincts, about a competitor who had underbid a contract and was going to regret it. Lily was trying to tell Carol about something that had happened at preschool, and every time Lily got to the good part of her story, Raymond's voice rose just slightly to pull the attention back. I watched Carol. I watched her smile at Lily and lean in to hear the story and gently redirect the conversation back to her granddaughter 3 separate times. I watched her absorb Raymond's presence the way she absorbed cold weather, by making herself a little smaller and waiting for it to pass. Then Raymond looked at me. I don't remember exactly what had preceded it. Some comment I had made about the engineering firm I had spent 24 years with. Something about a bridge project I had worked on that I was proud of. One of those moments an older man has when he reaches back into the record of what he did and finds something worth saying. Raymond looked at me with the smile and said it. "No offense, Frank, but you're just not relevant anymore. The world moved on and left you behind." Renee reached for the breadbasket. Carol's hand found my knee under the table and pressed once. I looked at the table for a moment. Then I looked up at Raymond. I said, very quietly, "Is that right?" Not a question. He kept the smile. He said, "No offense, man. It's just reality. I'm not trying to be harsh." Lily, who was 5 years old and sitting beside Carol, stopped eating and looked at me with large, dark eyes that understood nothing about the words and everything about the feeling in the room. "Grandpa," she said, "do you want some of my roll?" I looked at my granddaughter holding out half of her dinner roll in both hands with the complete, uncalculating generosity of a 5-year-old who has identified a problem and is solving it with everything she has. I took the roll. "Thank you, sweetheart," I said. She nodded seriously and went back to eating. Raymond refilled his own beer and started talking about Nashville again. That night, After Renee and Raymond had gone home and Lily had fallen asleep on the couch and Carol was in the kitchen doing the dishes that Raymond had walked past 3 times without offering to help, I sat at the dining room table with my hands flat on the cloth. The candles had burned down. The pot roast had been finished. Raymond had taken seconds and thirds without comment. I had spent 24 years as a licensed structural engineer. I had designed load-bearing systems for 7 major bridges in 3 states. I had a PE license, a master's degree from Georgia Tech, and a professional record that had never once been questioned by anyone who actually understood what the work required. I was 63 years old, and I had let a man who flipped commercial property sit at my table and tell me I was irrelevant, and I had not said a single word. I sat at that table for a long time. Then I went to my study, opened my laptop, and made the first of several phone calls that would, over the following 8 months, completely rearrange Raymond Stokes' understanding of the world. The first call was to David Park, my attorney. Old friend. We had gone to Georgia Tech together, and while I had gone into engineering and he had gone into law, we had stayed close in the way that certain friendships stay close, not through constant contact, but through a quality of trust that does not require maintenance. I told David what I needed. I want to revisit the estate documentation, I said. All of it. The house, the investment accounts, the retirement funds. I want it restructured. David asked the right questions and did not ask the wrong ones. I went to his office on a Thursday morning and signed the new documents before noon. I drove home feeling lighter than I had in 2 years. The second call was to a man named Harris Webb, who had been the structural engineering director at the Tennessee Department of Transportation for 11 years, and who owed me a professional courtesy that I had never once collected on. I described a situation. He listened without interrupting. "I'll make some calls," he said. "Good," I said. "I appreciate it." We hung up. I also began documenting. Every tool that had not been returned, photographed, dated, valued. Every instance of the truck being taken, I had already logged those in a note on my phone going back 14 months. Every dollar I could trace to a dinner, a trip, a repair that had quietly become my expense. I am an engineer. Documentation is not a strategy for me. It is simply how I understand the world in measured, verified, recorded increments. By the end of March, I had a folder that was thorough enough to make David Park raise his eyebrows when I showed it to him. He said, "Frank, you built a case." I told him I built structures. It's the same discipline. I want to tell you about the morning I almost stopped. It was a Sunday in April. Carol was in the garden, early light, kneeling in the dirt with her reading glasses pushed up on her forehead. Lily was with us for the weekend, and she had followed Carol outside in her pajamas and was crouched beside her in the dirt, very seriously pressing seeds into the soil the way Carol had shown her. I stood in the back doorway with my coffee and watched the two of them, the 73-year-old woman and the 5-year-old girl, working side by side in the early morning quiet. Lily said something I couldn't hear. Carol laughed, the real laugh, unguarded, the one she saved for things that genuinely surprised her. I thought, maybe this is enough. Maybe protecting this is enough and I don't need to do anything more. Maybe I should just close the folder and let it go. Then I heard Raymond's voice in the living room. He had come to pick up Lily. He hadn't knocked. He had let himself in with the key Renee had given him 3 years ago that I had never formally revoked. He was on his phone, walking through my living room, glancing at things the way a man glances at things when he is calculating what they might be worth. I closed the back door. I went to my study. I made the calls I needed to make. The confrontation happened at a family cookout in August. Raymond's idea, held at my house, for a group of people that included 3 of Raymond's business associates, 2 couples from their neighborhood, Renee and Raymond and Lily, Carol and me, Walt from next door, and my old colleague Martin, who had worked alongside me at the engineering firm for 16 years and was in town visiting his sister. By noon, Raymond was working the yard the way he always worked, a room, hand on shoulders, big laugh, performing generosity with resources that belonged to someone else. He had used my grill. He had directed people to help themselves from Carol's garden without asking. He had introduced his business associates to me as Renee's dad. No further context, and moved on. It was Martin who did not let it pass. Martin is not a subtle man. He is a methodical, precise, New Hampshire-born structural engineer who has spent 40 years saying exactly what he means and considers social performance a form of dishonesty. He had watched the yard for 2 hours and assembled his own documentation in the way that engineers assemble documentation quietly, completely, without announcing it. He came to stand beside me near the back fence. He looked at Raymond across the yard. "Frank," he said, "this man is wearing your credibility like a coat he found on the floor." I looked at my old friend. "I know," I said. He said, "You plan to do something about it?" I said, "I already did." Martin looked at me sideways. He said, "What are you waiting for then?" I said, "The right moment." He said, "It's August, Frank. It's been August long enough." Raymond had gathered his associates near the grill. He was mid-story. Something about a Nashville deal. The same story in a new arrangement. One of the associates was a man named Douglas Holt, mid-50s, who I would later learn was the managing director of the regional development group Raymond had been trying to court for 2 years. Raymond was performing for Douglas the way he performed for all audiences large, assured, in full possession of a room. Then he looked across the yard at me. "Frank," he called out, "easy in public. You mind grabbing that extra propane from the garage?" He smiled at his associates. "He makes himself useful," Raymond said. The men beside him smiled back. Raymond had said it lightly. "The way you say things, when you are confident the room belongs to you, when you believe the person you have just reduced will absorb it the same way they have absorbed everything else quietly, without consequence." I set down my glass. I walked across the yard, not toward the garage, toward Raymond. The yard went quiet, the way yards go quiet when something is shifting beneath the surface of an ordinary afternoon. I stopped in front of him. Raymond's smile stayed, but something moved behind his eyes, a half-second recalculation, brief and quickly suppressed. I said, "Raymond, I want to introduce you to someone." I turned and gestured Martin over, and Martin crossed the yard with the unhurried stride of a man who has been waiting for his cue. I said, "This is Martin Kessler. Martin and I spent 16 years together at the engineering firm. We hold a combined 7 state PE licenses. Between the two of us, we have designed load-bearing systems for 11 bridges, 4 highway interchanges, and a pedestrian suspension structure outside of Chattanooga that won a regional design award in 2009. Raymond's smile had stopped reaching his eyes. I turned to Douglas Holt and put out my hand. "Douglas Holt," I said, "I know your work." The Riverside mixed-use project in Memphis, the structural consultant on that was James Ahern. He and I went to Georgia Tech together. Douglas shook my hand and his posture had changed, the particular shift of a man recalibrating the weight of the room he is standing in. "Yes, sir," Douglas said. "That's right," I said. "Good project. Challenging site. They made the right structural choices." Douglas nodded slowly. He looked at Raymond. Raymond looked at me. I looked back at Raymond, and I said, quietly, "No offense. It's just reality." Martin did not smile. Douglas Holt did. Walter from next door, who had been standing near the fence for the past 4 minutes, picked up his lemonade and took a long, satisfied drink without looking at anyone in particular. Raymond did not recover the afternoon. By 4 o'clock, Douglas Holt had spent 40 minutes in conversation with me and Martin about structural engineering, about the Memphis project, about a development opportunity in East Tennessee that Douglas said he had been trying to find the right technical partners for. He handed me his card when he left. He shook Raymond's hand briefly on the way out. The 2 business associates left shortly after. Raymond found me near the garden gate as the yard was clearing. His voice was low and controlled and carrying everything he had not said in front of witnesses. "You think that was funny? You think you made yourself look good? You've been sitting in this house your whole retirement collecting dust and now you want to," I said, "Raymond." He stopped. I said, "You borrowed my truck 41 times in 3 years without asking. I have the dates." I said, "You took equipment from my workshop that has not been returned, and I have the values documented." I said, "You have helped yourself to this property, this yard, this grill, my wife's garden, and this afternoon you introduced me to your business contacts as Renee's dad." Raymond's jaw was tight. His eyes were doing the rapid internal math of a man deciding whether to escalate or retreat. I said, "I want the tools back by Friday. I want the key to this house returned by the same date. I've already spoken to my attorney about the estate documentation. You are not mentioned in it." He stared at me. I said, "And Douglas Holt has my card now. Not yours. Mine." The silence between us lasted a long time. Then Raymond turned and walked toward the house. I stood in the garden and looked at the raised beds Carol had built with her own hands. The tomatoes were heavy and red in the late afternoon light. Renee came to the house alone 3 days later. She sat at the kitchen table and she looked at me with the face I had raised, the one she made when she was 11 years old and had broken my workshop window with a baseball, and came to tell me before I found out myself. Clear-eyed, braced, willing to pay whatever the cost was. She said, "Dad, I know." I sat across from her. She said, "I don't have a good excuse." I said, "I'm not looking for an excuse." She said, "I watched him take things from you for 4 years, and I kept telling myself it wasn't that serious." I said, "I know you did." She said, "He's not." She stopped. She pressed her lips together. She tried again. "He's not who I thought he was when I married him." I said, "I know that too." A long silence. She said, "What happens now?" I said, "That depends on Raymond. And on you." She looked at the table. She said, "I'm sorry, Dad." I said, "I know you are. That matters to me, Renee. It matters a great deal. I want to tell you what happened to Raymond Stokes. Not because I take satisfaction in it, but because you are owed the ending when you have stayed this long, and because incomplete stories are how people convince themselves that consequences aren't real. 3 weeks after the cookout, Douglas Holt called me. Not Raymond, me. He wanted to discuss a structural consulting engagement for the East Tennessee project. Over the following 2 months, I referred him to 2 colleagues who were actively taking on projects, made 3 introductions, and received more professional engagement in that period than I had in the previous 2 years of retirement. Raymond had spent 2 years cultivating Douglas Holt. I spent 1 afternoon being myself. Raymond's firm quietly moved him off the Nashville account in October, citing client relationship concerns. I do not know the full details. I know what Martin told me, which is that word moves through professional networks the way water moves through concrete slowly, invisibly, and without mercy once it finds the path. By November, Raymond and Renee were in marriage counseling. Renee told me herself. She did not ask me what I thought about it. She did not need to. In December, a Saturday morning, I went to the shop and found 3 boxes on the front porch. My drills, the orbital sander, the router, still with its blade adjusted to the setting I had left it at before it disappeared. No note. I carried the boxes inside one at a time, set them on the workbench, and stood in the shop for a while with the lights on. I ran my hand along the edge of the router. Same tool, same weight, different year. Carol found me in the shop an hour later. She came and stood beside me without saying anything. I put my arm around her, and she leaned into me the way she had been leaning into me since 1983, easy and practiced and without needing to announce itself. We stood in the shop together for a while. The light through the window was thin and clean and winter white. "Gerald," she said. "My name is Frank," I said. She laughed, the real laugh, the one I have been collecting for 41 years. "I know what your name is," she said. "I just wanted to hear your voice." I turned and looked at her. This woman who had counted her tomatoes in silence and said nothing, who had pressed her fingers into my arm in the back of a cab, because she understood everything and waited for me to understand it too. She was 63 years old, and she was more herself than anyone I have ever known. "It's going to be okay," I told her. She looked at me sideways. "Is it?" "Yeah," I said. "I believe that." She nodded, not quite convinced, not quite unconvinced. "Okay, Frank," she said. "Okay." In January, I found something tucked under the edge of the ceramic pot by the front door, wedged in next to the winter deadfall Carol hadn't cleared yet. A folded piece of paper, the kind torn from a notebook, the handwriting large and uneven and earnest in the way that 6-year-old handwriting is earnest. Each letter the result of a separate conscious effort. There was a drawing at the bottom 2 figures, one tall and one small, standing in something that was either a garden or a garden approximation, with circles that were either tomatoes or suns, possibly both. Beneath the drawing, in the careful, deliberate orthography of a child who has something important to say and intends to say it correctly, "I love you, Grandpa. You are my favorite. Sorry about everything. Love, Lily." I stood on the front porch in the January cold for a long time. Then I folded that piece of paper and put it in the breast pocket of my jacket, directly over my heart, and I went inside to where Carol was in the kitchen, standing at the window, watching the winter garden with her coffee in both hands, already planning what she would plant in the spring. I have told you everything now. Every tool that didn't come back, every check that slid across the table without discussion, every moment I chose to absorb something rather than name it, believing I was being patient, telling myself I was keeping the peace. I am telling you this because I spent 4 years confusing patience with permission, and they are not the same thing. Patience is what you give yourself when you are waiting for the right moment. Permission is what you give other people when you let the wrong moments pass without consequence. I gave Raymond permission for 4 years and called it patience, and the only person it cost was the woman who counted her tomatoes in silence and never once asked me to notice. Here is what I know now, at 63, that I wish I had known at 59. The people who love you will not need you to make yourself smaller, to make room for them. And the people who require your smallness to feel large are not people you owe anything to, not your truck, not your tools, not your table, and certainly not your silence. If any part of this has sat with you tonight, if you have ever absorbed a thing you should have named, leave a comment below. Tell me your story. Tell me where you're watching from. These moments, the quiet ones, the ones where something settles in your chest cold and permanent, those are the ones worth talking about. Share this with someone who needs to hear it. And if stories like this one speak to you, subscribe so you never miss what comes next. I'm glad you stayed until the end. So is Carol.